The winter had stripped the town bare, leaving streets empty of laughter and homes filled with the slow rot of sickness. Grain stores stood hollow, and mothers whispered prayers over children who coughed themselves into silence before dawn. It was in this climate of despair that the Holloway twins entered the world. Their birth should have been a moment of fragile hope, but instead it was announced to the town with lowered eyes and hushed tones. The twins were born without breath, still and silent as carved stone. The villagers, already tired from their own mourning, accepted the news and turned away, relieved perhaps that the Holloways would carry their own burden and not beg for pity. They never questioned the absence of graves. In a place where death had become routine, no one counted how many bodies were lowered into the ground. Behind the walls of the Holloway home, however, the story twisted into something darker. The infants had not died. Their breaths were faint, their cries stifled before they could rise. The parents held them not as gifts, but as hidden possessions, treasures kept in silence. It was not love that drove this secrecy, but something colder. A fascination with controlling life at its most fragile state. The Holloways told the town of stillbirths while preparing a life that would belong only to themselves. They believed that to raise children outside the world's eyes was to own them completely, unshaped by any voice but their own. The house soon transformed into a theater of grief, staged for those who passed by. Curtains were kept drawn, and the scent of burning herbs was allowed to drift into the street so neighbors would believe sickness lingered inside. Mrs. Holloway wore black veils long after custom demanded, speaking softly of her lost children, while her husband planted white lilies along the fence as if in remembrance. Their mourning seemed so sincere that no one thought to question the hollow look in their eyes. Yet within those walls, behind closed shutters, the twins were nursed in silence. The parents smothered every sound with careful hands and hushed every whimper until the children learned instinctively to be quiet. The deception was more than survival. It was a performance of control where silence itself became the first act of discipline. The hunger and sickness that plagued the town created a convenient backdrop for their secret. As families buried infants weekly, no one wanted to intrude on another's sorrow. The Holloways understood this. They fed on the town's weariness, weaving their lie deeper. And in that space of unquestioned privacy, they found a freedom to explore thoughts that most would never dare to voice. They began to see their children not as sons, but as instruments, blank pages on which they could write their design. Every movement, every sound withheld, was a thread pulled tight by their hands. The twins grew not in the warmth of parental protection, but under the shadow of methodical shaping. The Holloways saw themselves as chosen, perhaps even enlightened, for creating a family untouched by the chaos outside. Where others lost children to hunger or plague, they preserved theirs through secrecy and silence. This success inflated their sense of power. If they could deny death its reach, they could also deny the world its claim. It was not long before grief hardened into doctrine. Silence became law, and sorrow became a weapon to shield their true intentions. They began to speak of the twins as if they were spirits returned from the grave, not meant for the common world, but for something higher. The deception deepened into ritual, and the Holloway home became a shrine to a truth no one else could see. The townspeople carried on, passing the Holloway house without thought, never imagining what grew inside. They saw only a family broken by tragedy, not the hidden beginnings of a chamber where control would turn to cruelty. They pitied the parents and praised their strength, even as the Holloways rehearsed more elaborate forms of secrecy behind closed doors. What began as a lie told to avoid questions was quickly turning into a life built on silence, a silence that would demand more than whispers and veils to maintain. As the twins grew, their survival bound them tighter to the will of their parents. Their existence was a secret balanced on the edge of discovery, and the Holloways knew the cost of exposure would be ruin. That knowledge darkened their resolve. To protect the lie, to preserve the silence, they would be willing to do anything. And in that willingness, the seeds of something far more terrifying began to take root. The town believed the Holloway children lay in the earth, mourned and forgotten. But the truth was far more dangerous. They were alive, and in their quiet breaths, the foundation of a secret world was being built. A world where silence would become the cruelest sound of all. The Holloway home, once a quiet shell marked by veils of mourning, began to transform into something colder, something more deliberate. It was no longer a house of grief, but a sanctuary of private rituals where silence was sharpened into law. The parents moved through the rooms like priests of a faith that only they understood, their every act an offering to a belief that ordinary neighbors could not imagine. The walls themselves became part of this devotion, painted with fragments of scripture warped into commands that stripped away comfort and replaced it with discipline. The words stared back at the children day after day, demanding obedience and silence, promising that pain was proof of worth. Mr. Holloway studied writings that twisted the ideas of men like Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, whose work had been meant to address suffering but was here recast into a manual for control. Where Guillotin had argued for swift and merciful death through the blade, the Holloways found inspiration for something darker, prolonged, suffering as proof of endurance, pain as evidence of the soul's cleansing. These lessons were brought into the house not as scholarly thought, but as commandments, reshaped into the daily structure of the twins' lives. They became subjects in experiments of deprivation, trained to bend beneath invisible weights. Food was turned into ritual. The twins were fed in cycles of denial and reward, sometimes starved until their bellies shrank against their ribs, other times force-fed until sickness filled their throats. Their small bodies became a ledger of control, their weakness or fullness written in the Holloway's script of devotion. Hunger was explained to them as a holy silence in the body, while the pain of overfeeding was called a test of their willingness to carry more than they could hold. They were told that if they endured without complaint, they could remain above the fate of ordinary children who coughed themselves into shallow graves outside. This was not nurturing but ritual, each meal an offering that broke them down into something obedient and malleable. The rooms of the house became extensions of this order. In one, the walls were painted with verses that commanded stillness and endurance, written in thick strokes that seemed to shout even though the house demanded silence. Another room was stripped bare and cold, where the twins were locked for hours to learn patience in the dark. A third room was filled with relics, a rope knotted into circles, a basin of water meant to remind them of the womb, a collection of wooden crosses scarred with burn marks. Each space carried its own trial, a stage for the rituals that blurred punishment with teaching, cruelty with instruction. The silence deepened into rhythm, not just absence of sound, but the steady pulse of ritual that no outsider could understand. The twins learned not to cry because cries were not ignored but punished. If sound escaped their lips, their hands were bound behind them and they were forced to kneel for hours until their limbs trembled under their own weight. They were reminded that the womb had been silent, that they had been born into quiet, and that to break it was to betray the order of their existence. This belief was carved into them not by word alone, but through methodical pain, until silence became as instinctive as breath. The Holloways convinced themselves they were not cruel but chosen, their rituals a way of lifting their children above the rot of the outside world. In their minds, the town had surrendered to plague and famine because it lacked discipline, because it lacked silence. Inside the house, however, control ruled every second. Even the children's sleep was measured, their waking moments timed, their smallest gestures recorded in the parents' obsessive attention. Innocence was not allowed to grow naturally. It was pruned and reshaped, stripped of softness, until what remained was obedience without question. But control did not remain, limited to the twins. Servants who once worked in the house were drawn into the rituals as witnesses. A maid was forced to fast alongside the children until she collapsed, her body left in the cellar as if her failure had condemned her. The Holloways explained her disappearance to the neighbors as another loss to sickness, and no one asked further. In truth, her body had been a warning to the twins that silence was not only for children, but for all who entered the house. Every life that crossed their threshold became part of the experiment. Every death was folded into the silence as though it had been planned from the beginning. The Holloway home no longer resembled the rest of the town. It stood apart, not because of wealth or beauty, but because it carried within it a ritual that erased natural life and replaced it with methodical cruelty. From the outside, it still seemed like a house of mourning. From within, it had become a shrine to control where silence itself was the cruelest hymn. And as the twins grew, shaped by hunger, darkness, and twisted scripture, the rituals tightened around them like chains that could never be broken. The Holloway home grew quieter as the years pressed forward, but silence did not mean peace. It meant the sharpening of cruelty into ritual, the careful disguising of torment as tender games. To any who might have stumbled across the twins, the objects scattered in their rooms would have appeared harmless. Dolls, music boxes, wooden puzzles, small basins of water. Yet each of these was transformed under the parents' hands into an instrument of control. A methodical device of suffering disguised beneath the veil of care. In that house, the line between nurture and punishment was erased, replaced by rituals that stripped the children down to obedience while pretending to cradle them in love. The first of these games was water. The parents filled basins and instructed the children to lower their faces into the still surface. They were told it was a return to the silence of the womb, a way of remembering where life began. When they gasped too quickly, their heads were pressed down, held beneath until lungs burned and panic clawed at their chests. They learned that silence was not just demanded but enforced. that the body's natural cry for air was seen as rebellion against sacred order. The ritual repeated again and again until breath itself felt like a privilege earned only through submission. Then came wax. The parents melted candles in iron bowls, letting the hot liquid cool until it still scalded but did not kill. The twins' hands were dipped into the pale fluid, encased in layers that hardened into shells. They were told this was the shedding of sin, that beneath the wax their true skin would be revealed. When the casings were peeled away, their flesh came with it in raw strips, leaving fingers trembling and red. Instead of comfort, they were praised for endurance, told that pain was proof of their purification. Over time, the sight of candles no longer meant warmth or light, but the promise of another shedding, another quiet test of how much they could endure before breaking. The house filled with objects crafted by hands that believed cruelty could be hidden in plain sight. Dolls arrived, carved from wood and dressed in scraps of cloth with painted smiles that concealed jagged metal teeth. The children were instructed to cradle them, to rock them as siblings. But when held too tightly, the dolls snapped shut, biting into tender skin. Tiny rivulets of blood marked the children's arms, yet they were told the pain was only proof of their clumsiness. A lesson in gentleness. What should have been toys became teachers of pain, reminders that even affection could wound if not performed exactly as commanded. There was also the music box, a delicate instrument of torment hidden in melody. Its crank was wired to small blades, fine enough to draw blood without severing. The children were told to wind the box and listen, but if their hand turned the key too quickly, the blades would catch and slice the skin. The lullabies that followed were always mixed with the sting of new wounds, so that music itself became inseparable from fear. The melody was meant to soothe, but instead it stitched dread into their memory, binding beauty to pain in a way that could never be undone. Every instrument carried the mask of innocence, a disguise meant to confuse as much as to control. The twins never knew when play would shift into punishment, when comfort would reveal the sharp edge beneath. Their bodies bore the evidence in scars and tremors, but their minds carried the deeper wound, the erosion of trust, the belief that nothing was safe, that every gesture of care hid another cruelty waiting to surface. The parents knew this, and they fed on it, satisfied by the collapse of boundaries that left the children wholly dependent, unable to separate love from fear. The psychological toll was immense. The twins grew more silent, their movements smaller, their eyes wide with anticipation of the next test. Their individuality began to vanish, each act of cruelty pressing them into shapes molded not by choice but by submission. They did not play. They rehearsed endurance. They did not laugh. They measured their breaths. What should have been the innocence of childhood became a constant watch for danger disguised as affection. This was not an accident but a design, a methodical erasure of self that the Holloways called devotion. And yet the Holloways believed themselves righteous. In their minds, the instruments were not torture but blessings, tools to carve away weakness. They convinced themselves that their children were being elevated, set apart from the rest of a world that had surrendered to famine, plague, and despair. Where other children were buried in shallow graves, their twins survived, silent, obedient, purified through suffering. This belief insulated them from doubt, turning every scar they inflicted into a mark of divine favor. But cruelty, once begun, does not remain contained. The Holloways grew bolder, refining their devices, creating more elaborate rituals to ensure silence would hold. Every success, the twins' refusal to cry, their submission to pain, was celebrated as a triumph, proof that the rituals worked. Yet in truth, each victory hollowed the children further, draining them of what little humanity they still clung to. Their silence was not strength, but survival, a desperate adaptation to a world where even toys had teeth. The house that once smelled of lilies and candlelight now reeked of wax, blood, and fear. It was no longer only a place of hidden grief, but a chamber where innocence was broken and remade into obedience. The Holloways believed themselves unseen, their rituals invisible to the town beyond. But in their devotion to silence, they did not realize that silence itself was beginning to rot, spreading through every corner of the house until even the walls seemed to listen. And soon the silence would demand more than children to keep it alive. The Holloway home, cloaked in its endless performance of mourning, began to attract the curious. Distant relatives who pitied the grieving parents came bearing bread or news, and servants hoping for work knocked at the door in search of coin. From the outside, the house appeared lonely, a place that needed company. But once a visitor stepped across the threshold, the door closed in silence behind them, and the outside world never saw them again. The family explained these disappearances away with ease, citing plague, fever, or sudden flight from hunger. In a town drowning in loss, no one pressed for details. Every missing face could be swallowed by the sickness of the age. Yet inside the Holloway home, each absence became part of a new ritual, lessons in death designed for the twins' eyes alone. The visitors were never treated as guests. They were specimens, bodies taken into the family's order, reshaped into demonstrations of what silence meant. One servant girl, barely older than the twins, was locked in a chamber and denied food. The Holloways told their children that hunger was not only holy but contagious, that to watch another starve was to learn endurance for themselves. The girl wasted away slowly, her body shrinking to bone, her voice reduced to shallow moans. The twins were forced to sit beside her, their small hands placed against her trembling skin, while their parents whispered that this was the sound of weakness. When the girl finally fell still, they were told it was because she had broken the law of silence with her cries. Death was made into a warning, her absence explained to the outside as plague, but to the twins it became an inheritance. Proof that life was fragile and entirely at their parents' mercy. Another visitor, a cousin come to offer condolences, was taken deeper into the rituals. The Holloways filled copper basins with his blood, drained slowly over hours until his body turned pale and his eyes clouded with horror. The twins were made to hold the basins steady, their fingers slick with warmth, while their parents explained that blood was a river, and rivers only flowed when controlled. When the cousin finally collapsed, silence flooded the room, and the children learned that death could be poured into vessels and stored like water. They watched as the basins cooled, and from that day every reflection in polished copper reminded them of his face, pale and gasping. The cruelest ritual came with wax. The Holloways, who had already trained their children's hands in the shedding of skin, now applied the same method to outsiders. Boiling wax was injected beneath flesh with sharpened reeds, swelling the body into grotesque shapes as skin blistered and burst. Visitors screamed in voices that cracked the air. But within the Holloway house, those screams were taught to mean one thing: punishment for broken silence. The twins were made to witness, to kneel beside the dying and press their palms into the wounds as though holding the life inside. They were told this was mercy, that touching the dying was the only kindness one could give to those who failed. Yet kindness here was no more than another thread in the ritual, another way of binding the children to the belief that suffering was not cruelty but order. Every death was methodical, stretched into a lesson, never wasted. The Holloways chose not to kill quickly but to prolong the process, ensuring the children absorbed each moment. They did not hide the victims' eyes or soften their cries. Instead, they forced the twins to bear witness, to feel how silence cracked under suffering, to believe that silence was the only shield against such a fate. The deaths became chapters in a book only the Holloways could write, a record of obedience taught through cruelty. Each disappearance in the town was explained with simple lies, but within the home those vanishings were carved into the children's minds as commandments. The psychological toll was devastating. The twins, already stripped of innocence by games disguised as toys, were now yoked to death itself. Their hands, too small to carry such weight, learned to steady dying bodies. Their ears, trained to hear silence, could no longer forget the sounds of suffering. They began to see every visitor as a sacrifice waiting to happen, every knock on the door as the opening note of another lesson. Childhood shrank into ritual, and ritual thickened into chains that could not be broken. The Holloways grew intoxicated by their success. To them, every visitor who vanished strengthened the order of their home. Their silence had expanded beyond the twins into the very soil of the family name. Outsiders provided not only fuel for rituals but proof that their secret was unassailable, hidden beneath the town's indifference. The more the world ignored the disappearances, the bolder the Holloways became, convinced that they were building something eternal. The visitors never returned and the town never asked. Behind the Holloway walls, the rituals deepened, their cruelty broadening from children's games to spectacles of death that no outsider could imagine. The twins were no longer only shaped by silence. They were chained to it, their inheritance secured not by love but by the memory of every body that had fallen in their presence. And as the rituals expanded, the Holloways began to prepare something larger, something that would move their cruelty from scattered lessons into a permanent sanctuary beneath their orchard. The Holloways had long grown restless with their rituals confined to the house. Too many visitors had disappeared within those walls, and though the town remained blind, the family feared the pattern might one day be noticed. They needed a sanctuary more permanent, a place where their cruelty could expand without interruption, where silence could not only be commanded but engineered. It was beneath their orchard, among the roots of apple trees heavy with fruit, that they chose to build it. The earth was soft, the soil fed by years of hidden burials, and the orchard itself provided cover for their labor. Neighbors believed they were digging root cellars to preserve food against famine, never realizing the chambers would be used to preserve suffering instead. The chamber was carved deep and lined with stone, Its walls were sealed to swallow sound so that no cry, no gasp, no final breath could escape. In this underground vault, silence was not just enforced, it was absolute. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of soil and fruit from above, as if the orchard's sweetness masked the decay beneath. The Holloways called it their church, a place where life and death could be held in their hands, shaped into rituals that would endure long after the town's memory faded. Here, the twins would no longer only witness cruelty in passing. They would be baptized in it, surrounded by it, made into its keepers. Across the ceiling, the Holloways arranged hooks, each one hammered into the stone and placed with care. They were not random, they were patterns, constellations recreated in iron. The sky itself was inverted, stars remade into points of suffering. Each hook was reserved for what the Holloways called a falling star, a victim chosen to illuminate the chamber with their slow destruction. Bodies were suspended by rib cages pierced and hung so that gravity pulled at their bones day by day. Flesh tore gradually, sinew unraveling in whispers of agony, until at last the weight of the body severed it from itself. Death was never sudden here. It was a drawn-out process, a spectacle of gravity and time, designed to teach endurance to the living who watched. The twins were made part of this ritual. They were instructed to name each star, to give identities to the victims that had been erased in life. Some were servants, others distant relatives, others wanderers who had simply knocked at the wrong door. Their names were stripped from them outside, but inside the chamber the Holloways gave them new ones, names of stars, of signs, of omens. The twins whispered them as if reciting prayers, their voices trembling, their eyes wide as they watched bodies sway gently in the chamber's still air. Every victim was transformed from a person into a celestial marker, another point in the family's private sky. The psychological toll on the twins deepened. They were told this naming was sacred, that it bound them to the heavens, that they were not witnessing death but charting destiny. Yet in truth, every word they spoke pressed them further into complicity, tethering their childhood to a ceiling of hooks. They began to associate the stars above with bodies below, the night sky itself with suffering. Their world shrank until every twinkle of light in the heavens reminded them of blood dripping from flesh, of cries swallowed by stone. The Holloways had not only stolen their innocence, they had stolen the very sky and remade it into a map of torment. The orchard above grew lush. Apples swelled larger, their sweetness unnatural, their juice darker. Villagers praised the Holloways for their bounty, never guessing that the roots of those trees drank from soil fed by the blood and fluid seeping down from the chamber. Children bit into fruit that had ripened on hidden graves, their mouths stained with sweetness grown from decay. The Holloways smiled, offering cider pressed from the harvest, their hospitality a mask covering the truth. Each sip was another reminder that the world could feast on suffering without ever knowing it. In the chamber, the deaths never ended. One by one, bodies became stars, constellations filling the ceiling until the chamber itself seemed to glow with their presence. The twins learned to measure time not by seasons or years, but by how long it took for a rib cage to split, for a body to collapse from its own weight. They were told that endurance was the greatest virtue, that silence in the face of suffering was a sign of holiness. And so they endured, watching life after life drain away in the chamber that was now their church. The Holloways, in their twisted logic, saw this as proof of their divine role. They had created a place where the heavens themselves could be remade, where stars could be called down into flesh and bound to hooks. They believed they had harnessed the laws of nature, turning gravity into a tool of worship, silence into a language that only they could speak. Their cruelty was no longer hidden behind games or excuses. It had become institutional, codified in the very walls of the chamber beneath the orchard. But even as the Holloways congratulated themselves, the silence of the chamber began to seep upward. The orchard grew too sweet, its fruit too heavy, its scent too thick. The townspeople, though grateful for the harvest, whispered uneasily of its taste, saying the apples carried something strange, something unclean. Still they ate, still they drank, still they turned away from questions they did not want answered. And the Holloways continued their rituals below, convinced that silence would protect them forever. The chamber beneath the orchard was no longer just a hiding place. It was a monument to cruelty, a church where bodies became stars and children were taught to pray in silence. The twins, once born into lies, now carried an entire sky of death above their heads. And as the orchard blossomed with unnatural sweetness, the world outside remained blind, never knowing that each piece of fruit held the memory of a falling star. Above the orchard, the Holloways wore the faces of piety. They walked among their neighbors with lowered eyes and gentle voices, carrying baskets filled with apples that seemed sweeter than any others in the region. The fruit, heavy with juices drawn from the blood-soaked soil beneath, became their gift to the town. Children bit into them with delight. Women praised their flavor, and men raised their mugs of Holloway cider as if it were a blessing in lean times. Even Queen Charlotte herself, passing through during her journeys, was said to have tasted from a cup poured at a banquet, unaware that its sweetness was born of hidden torment. The Holloways knew the power of appearances, and they wielded kindness like a blade, cutting suspicion before it could grow. In church, they sat in the front pew, dressed in mourning black that had faded into habit rather than grief. Their prayers were whispered with perfect devotion, their donations generous, their hospitality unmatched. The minister praised their steadfast faith, holding them up as examples of endurance in the face of loss. No one questioned the silence of their children, who sat pale and motionless beside them like carved effigies. The twins' quietness, once unsettling, became a sign of virtue in the eyes of the congregation. Parents admired their composure, saying they were models of discipline, while the truth was that every whisper of sound had long since been beaten and drowned into stillness. The twins were paraded as fragile, touched by sickness, blessed with patience, born of suffering. Their pallor was explained as a result of frailty, their silence as spiritual depth. Neighbors clucked their tongues in sympathy, never realizing the truth. The children were not saints, but prisoners, their obedience the product of years spent beneath hooks and candles. Their bodies bore scars hidden beneath fine clothing, but society did not look close enough to see. To the outside world, the Holloway family was a story of survival and faith. To those within the walls, it was an empire of suffering expanding unchecked beneath the orchard. The Holloways learned to balance their lives with precision. Above ground, they offered cider and fruit, bowed heads and blessings. Below ground, they tended their chamber of stars, suspending body after body in silence. The juxtaposition gave them a sense of invincibility. They believed themselves untouchable, convinced that their public piety not only concealed their sins, but sanctified them. Every handshake with a neighbor, every smile offered in the marketplace was another layer of armor protecting their rituals from suspicion. The more they gave to society, the less anyone dared to question what happened within their walls. This mask of normalcy was not only for protection, it was part of the ritual itself. The Holloways believed that deception was a sacrament, that to walk among the blind while holding secret knowledge was proof of their chosen role. They were shepherds guiding a flock too weak to know the truth. In their minds, the town's ignorance was not an accident but a sign of divine will, a confirmation that their cruelty was hidden because it was meant to endure. Each time they were praised, each time a villager thanked them for their generosity, the Holloways felt the hand of providence on their shoulders. They did not see hypocrisy. They saw validation. The psychological toll on the twins deepened. Forced to sit in church with hollow eyes, to smile faintly at neighbors while knowing what lay beneath the orchard, they became mirrors of their parents' deception. They were taught that silence in public was the same as silence in the chamber, that speaking even a fragment of truth would bring destruction on the family. Their every gesture became rehearsed, their every breath measured. They lived in two worlds at once, the bright smiling surface of piety and the shadowed chamber of hooks below. The division tore at their minds, binding them to a life where no space was safe, no face was trustworthy. The Holloways grew drunk on this duplicity. They began to expand their reach, offering cider to officials, sending gifts to neighboring towns, weaving themselves into the fabric of society. The more they gave, the less anyone suspected. The twins' silence became a story repeated beyond the village, a tale of children who had survived stillbirth only to live as delicate, holy creatures. Their image spread as a kind of legend, their very suffering turned into admiration. The world beyond the orchard began to echo the Holloways' lie, carrying it further than the family had ever expected. And yet beneath the orchard, the chamber of stars continued to grow. The ceiling filled with bodies, the walls soaked with silence, the air heavy with decay. Every act of kindness above ground was balanced with cruelty below, as if one could not exist without the other. The mask of normalcy was not a disguise but a ritual in itself, a performance that fed the Holloways' sense of power. They no longer simply hid their crimes. They believed that the act of hiding was the crime's sanctification. Society saw only piety, only generosity, only mourning turned to grace. But beneath those smiles, beneath the orchard's blossoms and the sweetness of cider, an empire of suffering spread its roots deeper into the soil. The Holloways had perfected their mask, and as long as the world continued to look only at the fruit, no one would ever ask what fed the trees. The Holloways had long understood that silence alone was not enough. The twins had grown into thin, pale figures, their bodies fragile but their minds still carrying the spark of individuality. That spark, small as it was, threatened the order the parents had built. To the Holloways, two separate wills meant danger. Two voices meant rebellion, and rebellion meant collapse of the silence they worshipped. So they devised new rituals darker than the ones before, meant not only to break the children but to bind them together until one could not breathe without the other. It was not enough for them to obey. They had to become halves of the same whole, fused by torment into something unrecognizable. The first device was an iron mask, forged heavy and fitted for two. It clamped over their faces in mirrored halves, pressing their jaws and noses into shared suffocation. If one struggled, the other felt the tightening of air, the slow closing of breath. The mask forced cooperation, not out of love but necessity, teaching that survival depended on submission. The Holloways called it the crown of unity, and they placed it on the twins' heads as though it were sacred. Hours passed in muffled silence as the children knelt side by side, their lungs burning, their eyes watering, until they learned to remain perfectly still. Silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the absence of motion, of individuality, of resistance. Then came the bindings. Leather straps sewn with hidden blades wrapped around their arms and torsos, binding them together back to back or chest to chest. Any attempt to move apart caused the blades to dig deeper, slicing flesh in thin, deliberate cuts. They bled when they resisted, but if they remained still, the pain dulled into a manageable ache. The parents told them this was proof that separation was sin, that their very skin cried out against it. Over time, the children learned to anticipate one another's smallest movements, to breathe in unison, to shift their weight as though controlled by a single will. Their individuality was cut away one slice at a time, replaced by the necessity of unity. At night, they were placed into caged beds built so narrow that every twitch bruised the other. The iron bars forced their limbs to overlap, their bones pressed together until rest itself became punishment. Sleep turned into another ritual of endurance, where they learned not to turn, not to stretch, not to claim even the smallest space for themselves. To move freely was to harm the one beside them, and so they remained locked together, their bodies aching with the burden of forced stillness. The Holloways watched from the shadows, satisfied that the cage was teaching them what no prayer could, that identity was weakness, and unity was survival. The toll on the twins was devastating. Their voices, already hushed into near silence, disappeared entirely. They no longer spoke even to each other, their communication reduced to instinct, to the subtle tension of shared breath or the faint tremor of a hand. Their eyes grew hollow, not with defiance but with resignation. They understood that to be themselves was to destroy the other, that any step toward freedom meant dragging the only mirror of their existence into ruin. Their silence had once been trained through fear. Now it was cemented through love twisted into chains. For the Holloways, this was triumph. They saw themselves as master sculptors, shaping flesh and mind into a unity no other parents could claim. Where neighbors praised their children for patience, the Holloways saw the deeper truth. Obedience so complete it had erased the boundary between two souls. Every scar on the twins' bodies was a mark of victory, proof that the rituals worked. They believed they had achieved what no church, no monarch, no law could, perfect silence through perfect binding. But the cruelty did not stop at devices. The Holloways introduced lessons in sacrifice, forcing the twins to endure pain not only for themselves but for one another. They were told to hold basins of boiling water, and if one faltered, the other was scalded. They were commanded to kneel on sharpened stones for hours, and if one shifted, the weight of punishment doubled for both. The children learned to carry each other's pain as their own, to fear not only their own suffering, but the suffering they might cause. This knowledge deepened the chains, twisting compassion into another tool of obedience. In time, the twins no longer resembled children but reflections, their movements so alike they seemed choreographed, their silence so deep it felt unnatural. They were not individuals but a single body stretched across two forms, bound by fear, by scars, by cages and crowns of iron. Their survival was no longer about resisting cruelty but about preserving one another within it. The Holloways had erased the possibility of rebellion by fusing their children into one. Yet beneath this triumph lay the quiet fracture of humanity itself. The twins' silence was not peace but despair, not obedience but exhaustion. Their minds, pressed into unity, carried within them the buried knowledge of what had been lost, the chance to live, to laugh, to be separate. The Holloways had broken them, but in doing so they had sown the seed of something dangerous, an emptiness that could one day demand release. For now, though the mask held, the bindings cut, the cage bruised, and the Holloways looked on, convinced they had achieved perfection, blind to the fact that perfection born of torment can never remain unbroken. Time had made the orchard rich, but its roots carried rot. Years of hidden death had seeped into the soil, feeding the trees in ways no natural earth should have allowed. The apples grew unnaturally heavy, their sweetness so strong it coated the tongue like syrup. At first, neighbors marveled, calling it a blessing in an age when famine lingered in every field. But blessings turned to whispers when sickness began to spread. Families who drank too deeply of Holloway cider found themselves bedridden with fevers that twisted the gut and blackened the lips. Infants weakened without reason, their small bodies burning from within as though they had swallowed poison. None dared accuse openly, but the town began to glance uneasily toward the orchard, wondering what fed its roots. Storms worsened the suspicion. Rains washed the earth away, loosening shallow graves and unearthing bones tangled in roots. Children found finger bones snagged like claws among apple stems, ribs half buried in soil where roots had grown through them. At night the wind carried strange cries, not the calls of animals, but sounds closer to human wails, slipping through cracks in the orchard as if the dead themselves begged for release. The children of the town began to avoid the orchard, running past it in fear, claiming they heard voices that whispered their names from between the trees. Parents dismissed it in public, but in private their unease deepened. Still no one confronted the Holloways. To speak against them was to risk breaking the silence the town had long accepted, and silence had become its own law. The Holloways, though, knew what the villagers only suspected. They saw the orchard faltering beneath the weight of its harvest. Roots choked on blood, soil crumbled under bones, and the very air above seemed thick with decay. The chamber below swelled with corpses, its constellations of hooks heavy with bodies, its stone walls sweating with the stench of rot. The silence, once their shield, now seemed to falter. Cries echoed in the family's minds long after victims had died, and the orchard's fruit carried an almost mocking sweetness. What had once been hidden began to press upward, threatening to expose what lay beneath. Frantic, the Holloways escalated their rituals. Where once death had been carefully spaced, now it became constant, as if volume could drown out the whispers rising from the earth. They killed not just to teach the twins, but to appease forces they could no longer control. Visitors were taken more frequently, their suffering stretched longer, their deaths more violent. Starvation was replaced with mutilation, silence enforced with greater cruelty. Victims were bound not only in the chamber but among the trees themselves, their bodies left to hang like rotting fruit until storms tore them down. The family told the twins that the orchard needed sacrifice, that the trees demanded blood to remain alive. The rituals, once bound to twisted theology, had spiraled into frenzy, driven not by control but by fear. The twins endured these escalations in silence, their bodies scarred, their minds cracked beneath the weight of endless death. They named more stars, their voices trembling as they tried to obey. But the constellations on the ceiling had grown too crowded. New victims overlapped old ones, hooks sagged, and chains clattered in the damp darkness like a macabre choir. Every new death pressed heavier on their souls. But resistance was impossible. To rebel meant not only their own destruction, but the destruction of the one who mirrored them. They bore it together, bound tighter by shared torment. Their silence no longer obedience, but exhaustion. The town, meanwhile, continued to ignore the truth even as rumors swelled. Missing kin were whispered about in taverns, and some swore they saw pale faces in the orchard at night, watching from between the trees. Mothers pulled their children closer when passing by, muttering prayers under their breath. Yet no one entered. No one asked. No one dug too deep. The Holloway cider still filled tables, their apples still lined markets, and gratitude still outweighed suspicion. Fear kept every mouth closed, and the silence that had protected the family for years continued to shield them even as decay poisoned the land itself. The Holloways grew desperate. They no longer killed to prove power, but to stave off collapse. They feared that if they paused, the orchard would turn against them, the chamber walls would crack, and the world above would hear the cries below. Their cruelty became a storm of its own, each act of torture a frantic attempt to hold back the tide. Victims screamed louder, their deaths more prolonged, but the soundproof chamber swallowed it, leaving only silence above ground. Yet that silence no longer felt victorious. It felt brittle, as if one crack in the surface would let everything spill out at once. The orchard had become cursed ground. Its fruit, once a mask of innocence, now carried sickness and dread. Children refused to eat its apples, claiming they tasted of blood. Men spat out its cider, saying it soured on their tongues. The Holloways, still offering baskets with smiling faces, watched as fewer hands accepted them. The mask of normalcy, so carefully built, was beginning to fracture, not from accusation but from unease too heavy to ignore. And beneath it all, the cycle of silence wavered. The twins felt it first. In the chamber, surrounded by hooks sagging under the weight of countless bodies, they sensed the rituals slipping. Their parents' frenzy no longer seemed like strength, but like desperation. The silence that had bound their lives now trembled at its edges, a silence ready to shatter. And when it broke, the world above would no longer be blind. The Holloways had built their world on silence, but silence alone could not last forever. The twins had grown into young adults, their faces thin, their eyes hollow, their bodies bent by years of deprivation and ritual torment. Yet within them lingered something the parents had never crushed, an ember of resistance buried beneath scars and obedience. The Holloways, sensing that time was running thin, resolved to extinguish that ember with one final act. If silence was to remain eternal, then the twins themselves had to be bound so completely that even the thought of rebellion would be impossible. It was not enough for them to obey. They had to become one. The contraption was built in secret, forged from iron and wood in the chamber beneath the orchard. Two mirrored frames stood side by side, each shaped to hold a body upright. Chains dangled from the ceiling, hooks embedded in the stone, levers designed to close the frames inward. When pressed, the iron walls would crush the twins slowly together, ribs overlapping, spines grinding, hearts nearly touching. Between them, basins waited to collect their blood, drawn by small incisions made along their arms and sides. The Holloways told themselves that this was not torture but union, a ritual of merging that would erase individuality forever. Two bodies would be fused into one order, two voices dissolved into the silence they had worshipped all their lives. The ritual began with precision. The twins were forced into the frames, their limbs bound tight, their heads pressed forward until they stared into each other's faces. The iron closed in with a creak that echoed through the chamber, pressing bone against bone, breath against breath. Blades scratched their skin, opening wounds that dripped into the waiting basins. The blood mingled, swirling into a single vessel as their parents looked on with fervent pride. They whispered that the twins were becoming eternal, that the merging of flesh and blood was proof of divine order. But something shifted in that moment. For years the twins had endured in silence, carrying their pain together, bound by necessity. Now, with ribs pressing until they could scarcely breathe, with blood draining as their parents chanted, they saw not unity but erasure. They saw that this final ritual was not meant to preserve them, but to consume them entirely. The ember of resistance long buried flared in their chests. For the first time they did not endure, they fought. The twins screamed. It was not a cry of pain, but a sound torn from years of silence, a scream so raw it split the chamber like thunder. Their voices, bound for so long, rose together in defiance, piercing the stone walls that had swallowed so many before. The sound traveled upward, forcing its way through soil, through roots, through the orchard itself. It escaped into the night, echoing across the village like a bell of morning. Neighbors woke from sleep, startled by a noise they could not place. Some swore it was the wail of the dead, others said it was the scream of angels. But all felt its weight. The silence that had gripped the Holloway home for decades had broken. Inside the chamber, the ritual unraveled. The twins thrashed against the frames, their blood spilling faster, their ribs cracking as iron pressed inward. Yet still they screamed, each breath pushing the sound higher, louder, refusing the order their parents demanded. The Holloways, frantic, tried to tighten the chains to force silence back upon them, but the twins' resistance only grew. The chamber, once a sanctuary of silence, now rang with chaos. Hooks clattered, chains swung, the very air seemed to tremble under the force of their defiance. Above, the neighbors gathered in the night, drawn to the orchard by terror and curiosity. They saw the Holloway house dark and still, but the orchard seemed alive, its branches shaking as if caught in a storm. The cries rose from below, muffled but unmistakable. Fear turned to fury, and the villagers, long silenced by suspicion and unease, broke through the Holloway doors. They stormed the house, their footsteps echoing through empty rooms until they found the passage that led beneath the orchard. What they discovered was a horror no one could forget. They entered the chamber to see the twins bound in iron, their bodies pressed together, their blood spilling into shared basins. Around them, hooks filled with rotting corpses swayed in the damp air. The ceiling transformed into a night sky of death. The walls dripped with fluids, the floor slick with decay. The orchard roots curling through stone as if feeding from the suffering below. The villagers gagged, some retching, others collapsing to their knees. The Holloways stood in the center, their faces twisted with fury, screaming that the ritual was sacred, that silence was divine. But the silence was gone. The chamber rang with voices, the screams of the twins, the gasps of the villagers, the moans of bodies shifting in unseen drafts. It was as if every victim who had died there now cried out through the voices of the living. The Holloway's empire of silence had collapsed in a single night, shattered not by discovery but by defiance. The villagers tore the contraption apart, pulling the twins free. They were battered, bloodied, their bodies broken by the ritual, but their screams did not stop until the frames lay in pieces on the ground. For the first time, the town saw them not as delicate saints, but as prisoners, survivors of a cruelty that no one had dared imagine. The chamber's secrets, once locked in silence, had been dragged into the open, staining the history of the village forever. The Holloways were seized, their protests drowned out by the cries of the living and the silence of the dead. The orchard above stood heavy with fruit, its branches bending low as if burdened with the weight of revelation. The villagers realized then what had been feeding it all along, and the sweetness that had once brought them pride turned to poison in their mouths. The truth could not be buried again. Silence had been broken, and nothing would return it to its former state. The Holloways were executed swiftly, their bodies taken to the gallows and dropped into the silence they had once worshipped. The crowd watched, not with triumph but with dread, for no rope could erase what had been uncovered beneath the orchard. The chamber of hooks, the basins of blood, the twisted devices of iron and wax, these were not simply crimes of a family but wounds inflicted on the conscience of an entire town. Death ended the Holloway's breath, but it did not end their reach. The horror they left behind lingered, seeping into memory, law, and superstition. In the years that followed, laws were rewritten. Births and deaths were now required to be recorded under state oversight. Each life counted and verified so that no child could vanish into silence and no corpse could disappear into shallow soil. These laws spread beyond the village, carried by whispers of what had been discovered. Officials cited the Holloways without naming them, saying only that tragedy had proven how secrecy bred evil. Families that once buried their dead in private fields were forced into churchyards, their records sealed and signed. What had been hidden in one orchard changed the way entire regions governed life and death. Yet the orchard itself remained, though stripped of its fruit. Memorial stones were placed among the trees, etched with names of those known to have vanished, though many of the dead were never identified. The stones stood in rows like gray teeth breaking through the soil, but few visited them without trembling. Children dared one another to run between the trunks at dusk, claiming they still heard whispers in the branches, voices rising when storms passed overhead. Farmers refused to plant near the roots, saying the soil was poisoned with more than rot. The orchard became a scar on the land, a reminder of sweetness that had once fed the town but carried death in its harvest. The twins themselves disappeared from record. Some said they died young, their bodies broken from years of torture, buried in unmarked graves to escape the weight of their past. Others believed they were taken away in secret, locked in asylums where silence was demanded and suffering disguised as treatment. A few claimed to have seen them years later, thin figures in black moving wordlessly through distant towns. Their fate was never known, and perhaps that was its own cruelty. Survivors should bring closure, yet their silence left only unease, as if their lives had been erased along with their names. Whispers of the Holloway's methods did not vanish with their deaths. Instead, they echoed through later institutions. Asylums built in the following decades included padded silence chambers, where patients were locked away for hours or days, punished for speaking too loudly or resisting treatment. Orphanages, too, adopted punishments that mirrored Holloway rituals. Children denied food for disobedience, forced into beds so narrow that every movement caused pain, beaten into silence with the justification of discipline. The mask of care remained, but behind it the same belief endured, that suffering could be reshaped into obedience, that silence was proof of purity. What had once been hidden in a single home spread like a shadow into systems meant to nurture. The Holloway's cruelty lived on not as open ritual but as practice disguised beneath noble words. It proved that evil does not need chaos or thunder to endure. It can grow in calm voices, in gentle hands that offer fruit, in laws and institutions that claim to protect while quietly consuming those within. The orchard was unique only in its discovery. What it represented was far older and far more dangerous, the ability of cruelty to hide in plain sight, covered by silence that no one dares to break. And so the story of the Holloways lingers. The stones in the orchard remain cold. The laws still trace their origin to an unnamed tragedy, and the fate of the twins drifts into rumor. But the lesson is heavier than any law or stone. It asks a question that remains long after the gallows have emptied and the orchard has withered. What silence are we ignoring now? What hidden chambers lie beneath the places we call safe? Evil does not arrive with a roar. It settles quietly in the corners, feeding on our refusal to look, to question, to speak. And if silence protected the Holloways for decades, could it not take root again today?